He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stopped. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't stepped aside, just stood there, eyes forward, jaw tight, blocking the corridor, like he'd been placed there for exactly this moment and the man standing. On the other side of that door was the king. There are rules inside the palace that no one writes down. Rules that are not found in any oath of service, briefing, or document. Rules that are just, well known, transmitted covertly from one generation to the next, as if it were too delicate or hazardous to discuss publicly. Someone had enforced one of those rules against the king, himself and the people who saw it happen. Never spoke about it again. It was a Tuesday. That detail shouldn't matter. But for some reason, it always comes back that way. A Tuesday, gray outside. The kind of morning that felt like it was holding its breath. The east corridor of the palace was quieter than usual. A skeleton staff. A reduced schedule. The kind of day where the building almost forgets what it is. Just stone and carpet and old portraits that watch you move. Thomas had worked the children's wing rotation for 11 years. He wasn't senior, not in any official sense, but he was trusted. That distinction mattered more than rank in a place like this. Trust was the currency. Everything else was just uniform. He'd been briefed the night before. Brief was perhaps too generous a word. It was 4 sentences, delivered in a low voice by a man whose name Thomas was never given. The instruction was simple: no entry, no exceptions. Thomas had asked once. What that meant exactly? The man had looked at him for a moment without blinking. No exceptions, he said again, and left. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. Stories like this one don't surface often, and when they do, they tend to disappear quietly. The morning passed without incident. 2 housekeeping staff were redirected. A junior aide who'd taken a wrong turn looked briefly confused, then apologized and reversed without question. Normal enough. Thomas kept his position, hands behind his back, eyes forward. Then, just after 11, he heard footsteps. Not the soft, uncertain footsteps of someone who'd gotten lost. Deliberate ones. Even the kind of footsteps that expected corridors to empty ahead of them. Thomas didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. He already knew, in some low, wordless way, before the figure even came into view. The king moved the way he always moved in private spaces, not stiffly, not ceremonially, but quietly. A man who had spent a lifetime learning how to occupy a room without demanding it. He wore no formal dress. A dark jacket, open collar. He looked, in that moment, less like a monarch and more like a grandfather who had somewhere to be. Thomas kept his eyes forward. The footsteps slowed and stopped. The king stood, perhaps 6 feet away. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the door, the plain, pale door of the children's wing, and then at Thomas. His expression didn't shift dramatically. It was more subtle than that. A slight adjustment. The way a person looks when they've encountered something they didn't expect and are quietly deciding what to make of it. "I'd like to go in," the king said. Simple, calm. Not a command, exactly. More like a statement made to someone who he assumed would simply step aside. Thomas didn't move. He kept his gaze level. His hands stayed clasped behind his back. He could feel his own pulse, steady but present in the side of his neck. "I'm sorry, sir," Thomas said. "I'm not able to permit entry at this time." The silence that followed was brief. Maybe 3 seconds, but it pressed down like something heavy. The king gave him a look. Truly looked, not with rage, not with the icy authority Thomas had prepared for, but with something more difficult to describe. Perhaps out of curiosity or acknowledgement, like a man who, more than most, knew what it meant to be told no, but was still debating whether or not to test this specific no. On whose instruction? The king asked. Thomas had prepared for many responses. That one, somehow, he hadn't. He held his position. "I'm not at liberty to say, sir." Another silence. The king didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at the door once more, as if the door itself might offer something that Thomas couldn't, and then he turned. He walked back the way he came, slowly, without looking back. Thomas didn't exhale until the sound of footsteps had fully faded. He stood alone in the corridor for a long moment after that. The pale door to his left, the empty hallway ahead, the portraits watching from the walls. He kept thinking about the king's face in that silence. Not angry, not embarrassed, just still. The way a person looks when they already know something. When they're not surprised, exactly, just quietly confirming what they suspected. That thought stayed with Thomas for the rest of the day and for a long time after, because it wasn't the refusal that unsettled him. It was the fact that the king had seemed almost like he had expected. Thomas didn't tell anyone that day, not because he was ordered not to, though he assumed that was implied, but because he genuinely didn't know how to begin. What would he say? That he'd turned away the king, that the king had simply accepted it. It sounded wrong no matter how he arranged the words, so he said nothing. He finished his shift, returned his access card, changed out of uniform. He walked to the tube, sat in a window seat, and watched the city pass in the dark of the underground tunnel. He ate something that evening. He doesn't remember what. He slept badly. The children's wing wasn't what most people imagined when they pictured the palace. There were no gold fixtures there, no grand portraits. It was softer than the rest of the building. Lower ceilings, warmer light. The kind of space that had clearly been adjusted over decades to feel less like a historical monument and more like somewhere a child could breathe. Thomas had worked that corridor for years, and he'd always found the wing oddly moving. Not in a sentimental way, just the contrast. The weight of the rest of the building, and then this, something quieter, something that had been, at some point, deliberately protected from all that weight. Inside, one wall was lined with pictures. During routine security sweeps, he had caught a glimpse of them, mostly black and white. Kids dressed formally. Events that were no longer remembered by anyone. Tucked next to the older frames are the more recent ones, which are more informal and private than anything that ever made it to the media. The wing had a history that stretched back further than most of the public record, and that history apparently had rules attached to it. 3 days after the incident, Thomas was called in early. He'd expected it, had in fact been quietly dreading it, not because he feared punishment, but because he still had no real understanding of what he'd enforced, or why, or on whose authority. He felt the way you feel when you've acted on instinct and only afterward begun to question whether the instinct was sound, that the man who met him was different from the one who had given the original briefing. Older, more relaxed in the way that people who hold serious authority sometimes are, comfortable in silence, unhurried. He offered Thomas tea. Thomas accepted, but didn't drink it. "You handled Tuesday well," the man said. Thomas waited. There may be questions, informal ones, from people inside the household. A pause. You don't need to confirm or deny the specifics. You were following protocol. That's all anyone needs to know. Thomas nodded slowly. "Can I ask what the protocol was protecting?" The man looked at him for a moment, not unkindly. "You can ask," he said, and said nothing else. The questions did come. Gently and indirectly, the way questions inside the palace always did. A colleague mentioning in passing that Tuesday had apparently been a bit unusual. A senior aide offering a look that lingered a half second too long. Small probes designed to see how much Thomas carried in his expression. He gave them nothing. Not out of loyalty to an institution he was only beginning to understand, but because he genuinely had nothing to give. He had a door, an instruction, a moment in a corridor. That was all. But the questions told him something. They told him that others had noticed, that whatever had happened, whatever had brought the king to that corridor on that gray Tuesday morning, it hadn't gone entirely unobserved, and somewhere, quietly, people were trying to understand it too. A week later, Thomas was reassigned, not punished, not dismissed. Simply moved different rotation, different section of the building. It was handled the way all sensitive movements inside the palace were handled, without explanation, without drama, as though it had always been scheduled and he'd simply forgotten. He accepted it. What else was there to do? But on his last evening in that corridor, before the shift ended and the next guard took position, Thomas stood alone outside the pale door for a moment. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Some trace of Tuesday, maybe. Some residue of what had passed between him and a man who wore the weight of a country on his shoulders and had stood quietly in a narrow hallway and simply accepted a closed door. There was nothing, of course, just the door, just the light, just the photographs inside that no one was talking about. He turned and walked away, but he kept thinking about the king's eyes in that silence. There had been there's something underneath the stillness that Thomas hadn't been able to name then. He was starting to think. He could name it now. It looked like grief. Old grief. The kind that doesn't ask for anything anymore. The kind that has simply learned to stand outside closed doors. Months passed. Thomas settled into the new rotation. Different corridor, different rhythms, different faces passing through. The palace had a way of absorbing disruptions, quietly folding them into the routine until the routine became the only thing that seemed real. He stopped thinking about Tuesday as often, or told himself he did. Then, in early spring, he met Margaret, not in a social sense. She wasn't that kind of acquaintance. After decades of employment as a domestic helper, she retired and now lived peacefully in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. Through a mutual coworker, Thomas met her at a low-key, intimate event that had no special meaning at the time. She was in her late 70s, sharp eyes, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks, and when she speaks, people tend to stop what they're doing at some point in the evening. The conversation drifted the way it sometimes does among people who have worked inside the same walls for different generations, toward the palace, toward the things that didn't make it into memoirs or official histories. Thomas didn't bring up Tuesday. Margaret did. Not directly, not by date or detail. But she said something that lodged itself in him like a splinter. She said that wing has always had its own rules, even when the family didn't understand them. He looked at her. She was gazing at her glass, not performing the statement, just offering it. The way you offer something you've been carrying for a long time and have grown tired of holding alone, Thomas asked. Carefully what she meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that when she had first joined the household a very long time ago, she had been told that certain parts of the palace carried what her supervisor had called a different kind of memory, that some spaces held things that even the family had agreed, in their own way, to leave undisturbed. Agreed, Thomas repeated, or were told to. Margaret looked at him then. Really looked. Sometimes, she said, those are the same thing. He didn't sleep well that night either. He lay in the dark and thought about the king's face. That stillness. That look of a man confirming something rather than discovering it. And he thought about the photographs he'd glimpsed inside the wing. The black and white ones. The children in formal clothing standing in spaces that no longer existed in any public record. Who were they? He'd never asked. It had never seemed like the kind of question you asked. The palace trained that instinct out of you early, not through threats, but through the ambient understanding that certain curiosities were best left unpursued. But Margaret's words had shifted something. The family had agreed to leave certain things undisturbed, which meant, at some point, the family had known what those things were. Over the following weeks, Thomas began paying attention differently. He wasn't investigating. He was clear with himself about that. He had no access to records, no authority to request documents, no connection to the people who might actually know. He was a guard. He walked corridors and stood beside doors and watched people move through spaces they mostly took for granted. But he started noticing things he hadn't noticed before. The way certain members of the senior household staff went briefly silent when the children's wing came up in passing conversation. The way a particular corridor was always cleaned early, before the day's official schedule began, by a woman who never appeared on any rota he could find. The way one of the older aides, a man who had served the family for nearly 40 years, always seemed to take a slightly longer route through that part of the building, as if the direct path cost him something. Small things. Nothing provable. Nothing that meant anything on its own, but together they had a texture. The texture of people who knew something and had made their peace with not saying it. He saw the king again, once. From a distance, at a scheduled walkthrough of a different section of the building. Thomas was stationed near the far end of a hallway. Too far for any meaningful interaction, just close enough to observe. The king looked tired. That wasn't unusual. He often looked tired in the informal moments, the spaces between the public moments, when he didn't know or didn't care who was watching. But at one point, he paused. It was brief, barely noticeable. He had stopped beside a window that looked out over a quieter part of the grounds. And for just a moment, he was entirely still. His hand rested. Against the frame, he wasn't looking at anything in particular. Or maybe he was looking at something very specific, something that wasn't visible from where Thomas stood. Then someone called his name softly from further down the hall, and the king straightened and moved on. Thomas stood there for a moment after, wondering what a person looks like when they are standing as close as they are allowed to get to something, and whether by now they have simply stopped counting the distance. Asterisk, it was Margaret who told him about the boy, not his name. She was careful about that. Careful in the way people are when they've held something for a long time and have learned, through experience, exactly how much of it they can release without the whole thing coming undone. They'd met again in the same informal way. A quiet afternoon. Tea this time, not a gathering. She'd suggested it herself, which Thomas had noted. She sat across from him and looked out the window for a while before she began. Decades ago. She said long before Thomas's time, long before most people currently inside that building had arrived. There had been a child, connected to the family, though not in any way that was ever formally acknowledged. The connection itself was never the secret, she said. It was more complicated than that. The child had been brought to the palace during a time of private difficulty, not publicly, not with any ceremony, simply present, cared for. Part of the household in a way that existed below the level of official record. The children's wing, she said, had been arranged specifically with that child in mind. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What happened to the child? Margaret looked at her tea. They grew up, she said, as children do. She didn't say more than that. But the way she said it, the wait and the pause before, as children do, made Thomas understand that growing up had not been simple. That there had been loss somewhere inside that sentence. And the wing, Thomas said slowly. It was kept. It was kept, Margaret confirmed. The way you keep certain things, not because they're useful, because you can't bring yourself to change them. Thomas sat with that for a long time after he left her that afternoon. The wing hadn't been locked away because of something dark or scandalous. The way the palace's secrets usually played out in tabloid speculation. It had been preserved, quietly, persistently, across decades and reigns and staff rotations, preserved like something fragile that too much air might damage, and the rules around it, the unwritten ones. The ones passed in low voices from person to person, weren't about keeping people out. They were about keeping something in, some remnant of a child that had lived there, some trace of a time the family had never been able to talk about publicly, and had perhaps never fully been able to talk about privately either. He thought about the photographs on the wall inside, the formal poses, the careful stillness of children who had been taught early to hold themselves that way in front of a camera. He thought about whether any of those photographs was of the child Margaret had described. He thought about the king standing at that window, one hand against the frame, looking at something only he could see. The question that began to sit with Thomas, the one he couldn't put aside, was simpler than all the history behind it. Why had the king come to that corridor on a Tuesday morning? It hadn't been a scheduled visit. Nothing about his presence there had felt official or administrative. He had walked toward that door the way people walk toward things they return to privately. Without audience, without announcement, he had been turned away before reaching it. But he had come back. Not on that particular day. However, Thomas learned that there had been at least one other attempt through the cautious language of palace correspondence. Silent, unplanned, handled without any problems or justification. The king kept coming back to a door that would not open for him, and every time, it seemed, he accepted the refusal without stare. Argument, which meant one of two things. Either he didn't know why the rule existed, or he knew exactly why. And the knowing was what kept bringing him back. Thomas requested a meeting with the older aide, the one who took the long route. It took 3 weeks for the request to be acknowledged. He hadn't expected it to be faster. He waited without pushing, which was the only approach inside the palace that ever produced results. When they finally sat down together, the aide looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. "You're the one from Tuesday," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas said yes. The aide nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. He was a man who had spent decades inside that building and carried the posture to prove it. Everything held carefully, nothing offered quickly. "What is it you want to know?" he asked. Thomas thought about it honestly. There were many questions, but there was really only one that mattered. Why did it have to be him? Thomas said. Why was the king the one who couldn't go in? The aide was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't evasive. It was almost gentle. "Because," he said, "some rooms aren't locked to protect what's inside." He stopped there. Let the silence fill in the rest. Thomas waited, but the rest didn't come. Some rooms aren't locked to protect what's inside. Thomas turned that sentence over for weeks. At first, he made an effort to approach it rationally. He was methodical, patient, and used to seeing the structure beneath things. However, he was unable to find a structure for this sentence. It felt something, and depending on when he returned to it, the emotion varied a little. Asterisk, some mornings it sounded like protection, like someone had built a wall to keep the king from something that might wound him. Other nights it sounded like the opposite, like the room was locked to protect the king from himself. He spoke to Margaret one more time. Not to ask questions, he'd run out of questions she was willing to answer. Just to sit with someone who understood the particular weight of knowing. Something you couldn't fully hold. She looked older that visit. Or maybe he was looking at her differently. At some point, she said, without being asked. He was very young when it happened. Whatever he carries about that time, he's carried it almost his whole life. Thomas didn't ask what it was. He'd learned by then that asking directly only closed doors. "Does it help?" he said instead. "The wing being kept. Does it help him to know it's there?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. "I don't think help is the right word," she said finally. "I think it's more that it exists. It continues to exist. And for some people, that has to be enough." The palace had a particular relationship with the past. Anyone who spent real time inside it eventually felt that. The building didn't just contain history, it continued it. The same corridors, the same light at the same angles. The same faint sounds of a structure that had been settling into its foundations for centuries. You could feel, sometimes, how thin the membrane was between now and then. The children's wing existed inside that membrane. It wasn't a museum. It hadn't been sealed off and labeled. Life moved around it. Staff passed nearby. Schedules ran their courses. The ordinary machinery of a working royal household continued without pause. But the wing itself was held apart, deliberately, carefully, consistently. Whoever had established that, however long ago, however informally, they had understood something about how grief functions inside institutions. How a family can agree, without ever speaking the agreement aloud, to protect a wound by never touching it. But grief has an instinct. It circles, and the king had been circling. Thomas was nearing the end of his tenure when something unexpected happened. A junior member of the household, young, relatively new, came to him one morning with a question. She had been assigned briefly to a corridor near the wing and had noticed that it seemed permanently restricted. She was curious, the way new people always are before the palace teaches them not to be. She asked Thomas if he knew anything about it. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the older aide, about Margaret, about the man with no name who had delivered 4 sentences in a low voice and then walked away. He thought about all the people who had passed this particular silence from hand to hand, across decades without ever letting it drop. He thought about a king standing in a corridor, looking at a pale door and accepting again that it wouldn't open. "It's a restricted area," Thomas said. "Has been for a long time." She nodded. "But why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some things," he said carefully, "are kept the way they are because changing them would cost more than keeping them." She seemed to accept that. Or at least, she stopped asking. Thomas watched her walk away and felt, for the first time, that he understood exactly what his role in all of this had always been. Not to know, not to decide, just to stand at the door. He didn't expect what came next. It arrived quietly, the way significant things inside the palace almost always did. Not as an announcement, not as a formal communication, just a small shift in the schedule, noticed only by people paying close attention. The children's wing restriction had been lifted. No explanation, no accompanying statement. It appeared on the updated access protocols one morning like a correction to a clerical error. Matter of fact, unremarked upon. Thomas heard about it from a colleague. He didn't ask for details. He sat with it quietly for the rest of the day. He considered the king. If he was aware, regardless of whether he had received official notification or had just shown up one morning to discover the door unlocked, whether crossing that threshold for the first time had been a relief or something that defied easy description. Asterisk, he thought about Margaret saying, "For some people, that has to be enough." He thought about all the Tuesdays that had come and gone since the first one, and he wondered whether the king had walked through that door yet, or whether, knowing it was finally open, he found he needed a moment before he could. Thomas left the palace on a Friday in late autumn. No ceremony, no speech. A small gathering in a backroom tea. A few familiar faces. The kind of low-key acknowledgement that long-serving staff preferred to anything more formal. He shook hands. He accepted an envelope. He walked out through a side entrance he had used 1,000 times and stood for a moment on the pavement outside. The city moved around him the way it always did. Indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware. He didn't look back at the building. He'd learned, over time, that looking back didn't give you what you thought it would. The thing about working inside a place like that, truly inside it, past the public face and the official record, is that you leave carrying more than you can explain to anyone who wasn't there. Not secrets. Exactly, or not only secrets, more like weight. The particular weight of being trusted with things that have no clean resolution. Things that exist in the space between what happened and what was ever said about it. Thomas had spent years inside that space. He had stood at its threshold, literally, and held it closed when asked. He'd never fully understood why. That was the part he carried most. A few months after he left, he received a letter, handwritten, which surprised him. No return address. The handwriting was careful, the kind of careful that suggests someone choosing each word slowly. It was from Margaret. She said she was well. She said the city was cold, but she didn't mind. And then, near the end, she wrote something that Thomas read several times. She wrote, "I heard he went in." Quietly, one morning. Just himself, no further detail. No description of what had been found, or felt, or understood inside that room. Just the fact of it. A door, a man. A morning that was simply allowed to happen. Thomas folded the letter and put it in the drawer of his desk. He sat for a long time. He thought about what a person finds when they finally enter a room that has been kept for them, not waiting for them, not in any active sense. A room doesn't wait, but kept, held in a particular state carefully, by people who understood that the state mattered even if they couldn't always say why would it still look the way it had. The soft light, the lower ceilings, the photographs along the wall. Would the things inside be exactly as they were, or had time, as it always does, made its alterations while no one was looking? He didn't know. He would never know. But he thought about the king standing at that window months earlier, one hand against the frame, looking at something private and far away, and he thought about how a person holds themselves when they are finally, after a very long time, allowed to stop standing outside. Inside locations like the palace, there are tales that will never be fully revealed. They are too delicate, not because they are too harmful or too dark, though some are. Because those who carry them have long since discovered that some things can only endure in silence. That in order to fully translate them into language, something crucial like some texture or weight that is unique to the original is lost. Thomas had one of those stories. He'd told parts of it over time. To Margaret. To no one else, really? He wasn't sure why he was telling it now. Maybe because enough time had passed. Maybe because the people most directly inside it were old or gone, or had found their way through to the other side of it. Maybe because he was tired of being the only one standing at the door. The wing was open now, or so he understood. Part of the ordinary rotation, the ordinary schedule. Staff passed through it the way staff passed through every other part of the building routinely. Without particular significance, he wondered if the new guards knew what they were walking through. Probably not. The palace was good at that. At letting things become ordinary again. At absorbing the weight of what had happened into the daily rhythm until the rhythm was all that remained. But somewhere, he thought, the photographs were still on the wall. The formal kids cautiously standing. The more subdued, intimate pictures next to them. A record that had never been recognized by official history. A record that had been preserved for one individual, not for the general public or future generations. Asterisk so that when he finally walked through that door, he would find something waiting, not resolution. Not answers, just the proof. That it had been real. That it had mattered. That somewhere. in the stone and the silence of a building that remembered everything. A small life had left a mark that even decades, even a closed door, even a king's inheritance could not entirely erase. Thomas hoped that had been enough. He suspected, somehow, that it was. But there was one thought he couldn't quite leave behind. One quiet, persistent thought that had followed him out of the building and down the pavement and into the ordinary days of his ordinary life after. He kept thinking about the door, about how long it had been closed, about who had decided, finally, to open it, and whether that decision, quiet as it was, unannounced as it was, had been made by someone inside the palace or by the king himself, and which of those two possibilities was more unsettling.